Good morning, everybody. Great to see you for the second Green Arts Clinic with Katrina, and here this morning, and with Mike, who's joining us as well. Just for your information, we're recording this not for any purposes other than we have a record of the session for those people who might not have been able to attend in person. And over to Katrina, and good to see everybody this morning.
Yes, so we're delighted that you can join us for this Green Arts Clinic this morning. I know there may be some people, we had a quick look at the list and there weren't too many duplications of people who were here last week and this week. But if you're attending both, there will be a bit of an overlap, so apologies for that. But we just thought there were some topics that were raised last week, some questions that we wanted to keep for this clinic as well. But there's also some new stuff that hopefully will be of interest to you. And I suppose what makes these sessions interesting really is if people have questions. And maybe particularly from Mike, because Mike may not be able to stay with us for the whole of the session. He's got a young colleague that he's looking after, and that might interfere with some of his, it might distract him a little bit. So make the best use of him while he's here. We have an hour, and we're hoping to structure that around various questions that have been posed, but also, as I say, a slot with Mike. So we're delighted that he can be with us. There was a lot of interest in what he had to say last week. Mike is the technical officer for the Drama and Theatre Studies at University of Galway. So he's going to talk to us particularly around the Theatre Green Book and how he's used that in the work that he's done. And it must be said, if people have particular questions for him, just maybe to pop those in the chat in advance, and he can cover those in his session. So we received questions on a variety of topics, but one of the things that we felt was, it was actually Anna suggested that it might be useful maybe just to put it all in a little bit of context. We didn't do that at last week's session, and I think that's a very useful thing. So I don't have many slides, but I actually am going to share slides with you for this part. So let me just. This is always where everything slows down because it's just really not my forte. But now hopefully you can see that. Anna will
yeah,
not.
can you?
That's okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, and I'm going to show you. Yeah. Okay. So basically, you know, in terms of the context and where we are when it comes to climate change in Ireland, there are two recent reports that kind of give us information and give us a sense of, you know, how near we are to the targets that we're supposed to be addressing. And the two organisations that report. One is the EPA, so it's the Environmental Protection Agency. Again, many of you would be familiar with it. They have a legal responsibility in that they report on our emissions to the EU. So we have certain binding agreements with the EU in terms of our targets, in terms of, it's quite a complicated mechanism. There's a kind of an exchange that happens where you can kind of buy up credits from other countries. That's a little bit, I suppose, dodgy in this sense, but in any event, that's their legal responsibility. They report every year, and they have just produced a provisional report, which is for 2022. They don't have all of the data for last year, but they can do a kind of provisional report. They'll have fuller information by September, and they'll do a more definitive report then. So that has just literally been published less than a month ago, so that's very relevant to us today. And the other organisation or agency is the Climate Change Advisory Council. So that is the body that really is kind of keeping tabs on how the government is doing when it comes particularly to its own commitments. And they're all really contained in the Climate Action Bill, and particularly in the most recent Climate Action Plan for 2023. So if we just go, I don't want to do too much detail on this because it can be a bit dull, but I suppose what the EPA is telling us, hopefully if I can make that work, yeah, is, you know, that this report is they also deliver many of you will have heard of the National Dialogue on Climate Action. So they're also responsible for that. Some of that is done online, some of that is done in person, and they organise sessions around the country. But they estimated anyway that in 2022, the reduction of overall greenhouse gas emissions was 1.9%, so not really as much as we would like. There were decreased emissions in certain sectors, and those were most of the large sectors, except for transport and waste. Transport, we're going to come back to that later on. Transport is one of those funny ones. We mentioned it last week. Is one of those stubborn ones that tends not to move. It's a difficult one because it involves a lot of behavioural change as much as anything else. And waste, disappointingly, is increasing, and that has obviously an environmental impact as well as a carbon footprint. But a lot of that waste too is coming from building. So the more building that's happening, there's a lot of waste coming from that. Our emissions per capita, so I suppose that is good news. They've decreased from 12.4 tonnes to 11.9 tonnes. So that is a positive, but bearing in mind that the population is continuing to grow and it's expected to grow quite considerably by 2050. So, you know, we're dealing with a population, a country where the population is growing. So our emissions, and at the same time, we need to reduce our emissions. So that's a tall order. And they recognise that arresting growth in emissions is a challenge, but one for everybody. And I suppose that is one of the key messages of a lot of the work that we do, that, you know, that really it is about collaborative. It's about everybody feeling that they have a role to play. If we try and sort of identify one sector over any other as being responsible or at fault, that isn't really very helpful. So, you know, there is progress, but that progress is very small. There is then the Climate Action Plan, which many of you were familiar with. This came out of the Climate Action Bill. The idea is that within, for each year, there's an individual climate action plan, and that outlines specific details. Now, those can be quite, Irma can give you a link, I think, to both of those documents, or to all three of those documents, actually. And the good thing is they do now produce sort of summary versions of them that are generally 5 to 6 pages long, that are in reasonably simple language, that are reasonably easily understood. So there is information there that is really accessible to most people. It's not overly complicated. Just going back to the Climate Change Advisory Council, and they're kind of checking the state's progress on that climate action plan for the year. And, you know, they're basically saying that we're not on track. We're not on track for our first budget, which is our carbon budget, which ends in 2025, and we're definitely not on track for the budget that ends in 2030. So obviously none of that is good news. They do say that they noted with alarm, again, this just came out last month, just that concerning series of unprecedented events that have occurred, and we're all acutely aware of this. You know, the warmest day, the warmest ocean, warmest sea temperatures, wildfires and floods. So obviously that's all, you know, that's all pretty alarming. But what I would say is they do concentrate entirely on what we need to do. So rather than say, they point out that we're not where we should be, they point out the alarming, unprecedented weather we're having and where we should be, and then they focus on a whole series of recommendations of the things that we need to do. And again, there's a short, quite concise 5 to 6 pages worth reading where they go through that information. So I think, you know, there's no point really in lamenting in a sense where we are. We really just have to get to do the work that needs to be done. And just, I thought this is a useful graphic that they produce in that 5-page summary document. And in terms of the art sector and where we might be, where we have potential to influence or to make changes, transforming how we travel is a big one, because obviously we were talking last week about how arts organisations have potential to influence how their audiences travel. And there's also a certain amount of travel involved in a lot of artistic activity as well. So there's great potential for us to have a role in that. And the action plan says we will drive policies to reduce transport emissions by improving our town, city, rural planning, and by adopting the avoid, shift, improve approach, reducing or avoiding the need for travel, shifting to public transport, walking and cycling, and improving the energy efficiency of vehicles. So that's one of the areas where all of us can have a role to play as citizens, never to mind as and we're changing how we produce, consume, and design our goods and services by breaking the link between fossil fuels and economic progress. Decarbonising industry and enterprise is key to Ireland's economy and future competitiveness. So those are the key ones, I would say, for us, for the arts sector. I think that's the end of me there. So we're conscious now that because we don't have Mike for a long time, that we might ask him to speak now, if that's okay, Mike.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. She's in good enough form here anyway, so far so good.
Great. Thanks a million.
Okay, I'll just try and sorry, share screen now. So yeah, I'm going to chat about I suppose the Theatre Green Book, and hopefully everyone is kind of familiar with it, but particularly from, I guess, our position in an educational setting. Now, I said last week, and I always kind of say, I come from a position of great privilege in this, in that I work on a campus that is very active in the sustainability realm. We work in a theatre that was opened in 2017, which is 100% LED. And as I've kind of littered throughout, I work with people that we're allowed to tell what to do. So I'm very aware that that's not always the case in many of your other venues, but hopefully some of the things along the way are kind of useful. So as I said, we were opened 2017. We're the first 100% LED theatre in the country, and we're blessed with all sorts of modern HVAC and fire systems. And, you know, it's worth noting as well, if anyone needs to go down the LED lighting fixtures route, that it has an impact not just on your bill, but also on the amount of aircon that you might need to pump into the room, because, you know, the lights aren't generating as much heat. And so there's all sorts of other little knock-on effects. It often saves a lot of time working at height for employees and things as well. So if you're struggling to get that budget, there's a few different angles at which you could kind of go about trying to get it. And again, I put my email in the chat there. I'm happy to chat to anyone about it. So we, formerly known as NUI Galway, just in case anyone didn't know what University of Galway was, we had emissions targets set for 2025 and 2030 that have already been beaten. So we seem to be anyway kind of leading the charge in this realm, and we've now been chosen to be one of the SDG champions for the next couple of years, and I'll talk a little bit about them later on. We have a full-time sustainability officer on campus, which is a great thing. So Michelle's role is to 100% just look at all the output, you know, be it waste or energy, and kind of see about how to, you know, improve that. I mean, a lot of you probably have conference-style events, you know, that come through your place. We have an awful amount of those, and that's one area that really, up to recently, has been lagging very badly in the sustainability realm, and that, you know, people get plastic lanyards, and it's a lot of single-use coffee cups at lunch, and people traveling far distances to come to conferences and things. So having Michelle in that role has really helped in that kind of regard. There's an awful amount of the buildings on campus currently running or part running on solar power, with plans for more. So again, I said, we're just very blessed to have the team. And we also have a team who are kind of really gone at the biodiversity side of the campus. I don't know if anyone works on the campus, but up until recently, we noticed, I mean, they all look very beautiful, but if you look at what's actually growing, it's a lot of kind of shrubs and green, non-pollinator, easy to maintain plants and things. So it's nice to see the university's now taking a pretty serious charge at planting wildflowers and pollinator flowers, and there's new beehives and things all over the campus. So again, I say I come from a place of great privilege here. And we also this year launched an MSc in Sustainability Leadership, which I suppose the hope there is that would attract you know, maybe business owners or managers, people in kind of those leadership roles who want to improve, who want to improve a little bit on their sustainability practices across the board. And yeah, the SDGs now kind of feature in all our planning and decision making. So this is us, for anyone that hasn't been. We're a small enough venue. We're 120 seats. It's a 9x11 black box. We produce 2 very large shows per year with the students, and then we produce countless smaller shows. So every student, when they finish their module in acting or directing, whatever it is, will put on some sort of small 15-minute performance. And that is where, you know, I suppose an adaptable venue really starts to shine, and, you know, having lights to change color and things like that. We do then throughout the year accommodate shows from all the festivals. So the Arts Festival and Barbaro, GTF and GMR, and we try and kind of push, maybe is the wrong word, but we certainly try and encourage our sustainability practice onto those festivals. I know that Barbaro recently have commissioned their own sustainability practice or policy, and GIAF did quite a lot this year to kind of lower their carbon footprint as well. So we try to set out to be, I suppose, an example for the students in that. I don't know if anyone's at Theatre Forum down in Waterford, but I kind of had a few minutes to speak, and I just spoke about how we've really, maybe not necessarily just us, but a generation that has come ahead of our current students has sort of, for lack of a better word, kind of shat on that generation, and that they'll have to create theatre in a much different way with an awful lot of different considerations that maybe we didn't have to make, and certainly generations that came before, you know, myself didn't have to make. And how I suppose that's quite unfair on that generation, and that we now really need to do as much as we can to help them along that path. So we try and lead by example in everything that kind of we do in the centre. And, you know, we've been a paperless department for several years now, and we adopted very heavily the Green Book, the Theatre Green Book, when it came out in 2021, and it's kind of become a core text on our production modules. We've done all the little things, and I'm sure there's several venues on here that have as well, and maybe artists in their own craft have done it. So we don't use things like PVC tape. You know, we've got kind of stretchy ties and Velcro straps and things that replace that. We try not to use gaffer tape on floors. We use cable ramps and things. There's a lot of very small things you can do, like rechargeable batteries, that actually are very low cost in terms of investment. So €400 or €500 might see you to have a nice stock of stretchy ties and cable ramps and rechargeable batteries. And I mean, I know from working in other venues and working in the hire and supply business, like we would be selling thousands of euros worth of PVC tape and gaffer tape to venues every year. So, you know, again, there's cost savings straight away there. My particular pet peeve is about PVC tape is it's the way it's manufactured. It's a polyvinyl chloride, which produces all sorts of noxious chemicals into the environment. And then it's quite single use. It won't degrade for centuries, you know, and anyone that's worked on a theatre get out would see the amount of it that goes in the bin afterwards. So I'm happy to say it is one of those easy wins. So if you haven't done it already, again, I'm happy to jump on a call with anyone and chat about the various different things that we've kind of done. It does take getting used to, and you know, it's always faster to do things the kind of cheap and single-use way. It's easier to get a cup of coffee and paper cup and throw it out than it is to remember to bring your keep cup, and the same can be said for theatre. But, you know, 2 to 3 weeks, like anything, and, you know, those habits do kind of change. And I said, again, it's important to note my point of privilege is that we're not a full receiving house in the way some of your venues may be. So I appreciate fully that you mightn't be able to, or mightn't feel that you're able to kind of tell people what to do as much as you can. But I would say that you should try. Anyway, some people are up for things that you mightn't think that they would be, but you know, if you have a very big get-in, there might be a lot of time pressure, and that's where it gets hard. So we're growing our use of the Green Book each year, in that we, you know, in the first year it was just something we kind of briefly looked at and we discussed, and the second year it became something that we, you know, embedded into the classes, and in the third year it became something that was a core text which appears on the students' module outlines and things like that, so they kind of really get to look at it in great depth. So what we've been doing since we adopted it is monitoring the waste in terms of, and I suppose I'm speaking specifically about productions here because, again, the university would look after the building's general waste, but in terms of the production, so we look at what we produce daily, weekly, monthly. And then again, every show is different, but we all have certain similarities. So the students are really buying into it, which is great to see. And we actually found that like the big things were the easy part. So tackling the workshop, you know, it's very easy to reuse a piece of timber if you're smart about how you cut the edges off, and you know, it gets an inch smaller every year, and you don't use things like glue and you know, paint needlessly. But again, the Green Book was an invaluable kind of starting point to give us roadmaps on how to, I suppose, how to structure our approach and what we were looking at, and you know, little targets to kind of hit. The areas that were kind of more interesting were backstage. So one year we monitored the dressing room very closely, and we discovered you know, all the makeup buds and wipes and cotton balls and things that, again, these things just go in a bin. I think the bin is a bit of an enemy to sustainability, in that it's a sort of wonderful magic box that you just put your waste into, and then someone makes it disappear. So you know, we even kind of looked at things like having sort of clear bin bags and stuff, so people can kind of see what's going in them. And then what we have to do in our offices is we actually have what they call a bring bin, which is a little box that you put all your waste into for a day, and then you bring it to the bin at the end of the day, so you can see in a day how much waste you've actually produced, which I think is a good thing to be able to kind of see it. So the most waste actually came out of the rehearsal room, is what we found. So, you know, things for lunch, paper cups, sandwich wrappers, that kind of thing. So this year we really encouraged the students to make a kitty and, you know, bring in their own bread and ham and cheese, and we bought mugs and things like that for backstage. Same, I should say, sorry, for makeup, and that we kind of bought cloths and kind of alcohol to clean to actually clean the makeup itself so that it would kind of last even until next year. And again, the students are really, really helpful in that. So there are ways to just remove all these things. And again, they're kind of easy wins. You know, it's not, you don't have to replace the air conditioning unit on the top of the building and go to procurement and all that for it. So just as an example, we typically have 20 to 27 in the cast. That's, you know, if they have 2 cups of coffee from the bar, which they were doing every day, you know, we're into 200 a week, 800 a month, and, you know, several thousand across the life of the production. So just by kind of getting mugs and, you know, tea and bringing in milk, we put a 90% reduction in the waste. It is tough to give someone their macchiato or super latte cappuccino. They're the kind of difficult ones to do yourself backstage, but everyone who was having tea at least and kind of simple Americano coffees was making it back there. So just to give an example, like I mentioned this as well last week, I think I've said a bit that the word book could sometimes be a bit maybe daunting for people. The Theatre Green Book is it could be looked at almost more in pamphlet version. There's a short version and a kind of longer version. But I suppose not to be afraid of it, that there are chunks of text in it, but there's also an awful lot of, you know, diagrams and things like this that will show you very clear ways to navigate your way through the production. And they've really thought about every little step. I mean, they engage with so many stakeholders that, you know, people were obviously there in the room to kind of give their comments and feedback on the journey and talk about their own work. So we find it just an incredible map is the best way to describe it. So again, if you haven't looked at it yet, I really encourage you to take an hour with a cup of tea today and go and have a good deep dive on it. So it's what we're kind of trying to do is have this thing constantly around, you know, a copy of it constantly on the production manager's table or the stage manager's table. And, you know, then you can kind of, it's always there to go back to. We plan to look at it for any decision that we make about where we source a piece of set or costume or how we look at the schedule and, you know, where we schedule kind of tech time and, you know, dark time and things like that. So again, we're looking at not just our energy use, but also always the amount of waste the production is producing. And again, it's just wonderful. And now having the SDGs, I suppose we're starting to really look at sustainability across the board in terms of everything we can. And I think theatre is really doing great in this realm of, you know, having documents now like Safe to Create. And, you know, we're able to think about sustainability in a much more broad sense of, you know, people's wellness in the room and how they're creating in a more sustainable manner. I do think that we maybe promised ourselves a lot during COVID. I remember being on lots of talks where we all promised that things would slow down, that we wouldn't produce them at such high speed. And I don't know that we've achieved that. In many cases, I can say that we actually definitely haven't in what I've seen and that we've potentially gone backwards. But so it'd be good to kind of keep those talks going about how we all made some promises there when we had time to think and reflect. And, you know, documents like Safe to Create are great to have, I suppose, to guide us back to that way of thinking. Just quickly, anyone that isn't aware of them, the SDGs set out by the UN are a set of kind of, again, like signposts or roadmap goals that we should kind of be looking at. Now in theatre, we can't tackle all of these, but we can tackle the ones such as, you know, what we're sending out into water, what we're sending out into landfill, the quality of the education, I suppose, and particularly in our case that we're providing to the students. You know, I think we're starting to get really good in the realm of kind of the quality across the board in terms of theatre. But again, no more than the Theatre Green Book, they provide a very, very good roadmap. So if your practice, your organisation isn't aware of them, again, I'd strongly suggest kind of have a look. And you start to find, I think we certainly have a lot where if we're applying for any funding on campus, we have to link our objectives back to the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we want to buy a new computer, you know, we have to explain how it's going to improve the quality of education. It's produces lower overall wattage and things like that, and you know that it's made of materials that will be far more recyclable. Which Mac, I have to say, win out hands down in that realm. So just to kind of summarize, then I'll just give a few things that we found really difficult. So having a budget for change, that's always going to be the biggest thing. Habits and pattern breaking. Again, position a real privilege here. I have students that don't necessarily have habits or patterns yet, so we're able to kind of hopefully form them. But I know what it's like working on productions that you've been working on in a particular way for 30, 40 years, and it is tricky to break the habit. Procurement is something that we struggle with an awful lot, and I know there's some work being done in the Senate at the minute about changing the way that government procurement contracts work, and that it won't all be based on price. That things will have to be included, such as, you know, sustainability and where food is actually being sourced, how it's disposed of. what the ethos of certain companies are. I won't name any ones that have really bad ethoses, but I'm sure you're all aware of them. And then time and human energy, like all this stuff is going to take more time. And I know there's been discussion about how reusing a set is wonderful. And Katrina might mention Steve's work somewhere down in Moat, and the idea of kind of collecting sets now that can be reused. But it ultimately takes more time to go and pull screws and things out of timber as opposed to get fresh timber delivered to you and chop it up. So productions are going to have to start factoring that kind of thing in as well. And hopefully the Arts Council will maybe see that and might start putting lines and budgets and things for us. And then just a few kind of small tips I'd give just to wrap up is, what I'd say is look in your bins or have them emptied less often. It's a great thing to kind of just leave rubbish sitting in front of people and let them see what they've actually produced in a week. Like those shows where they show you how much sugar you had in a year. And when you see it all in front of you and go, you think, oh my God, this is hideous. If you left all the coffee cups in the bin until Friday, you'd see people getting a bit worried. You have to talk as a group, I suppose, about what changes people can actually make and what they can get behind, because it kind of has to be a team effort or it'll fail. Keep in mind that you're not going to fix it all in the first round. So to think about what you can control and what changes you can make kind of incrementally. And you'd be surprised as to how the first round, you actually might make a pretty substantial dent by getting rid of those small, easy wins like the tape and the coffee cups and things like that. If you can, they do add up. And then lastly, I'd often just say, like, if you're in a rehearsal room developing work, or you're in a control room, or you're in your office, is always just kind of have a look around and see what's actually on right now. There might be huge amounts of equipment that's on in a venue that isn't needed. I know particularly on campus is one thing that we get stuck with a lot because of the nature of the way the classrooms are used, that a lot of kind of, amplifiers and projectors and things like that often get left on because there's another class in 20 minutes and people don't turn them off. And that's something the university is looking at the minute. But certainly I know from my time in the theatre that you might have relay mic equipment or, induction loop systems and things that are left on 24/7 that, possibly don't need to be, and certainly computers and monitors and offices and things that don't need to be. So if you can kind of be taking a list of what you're throwing out and what you're taking in terms of energy, you'll probably find a couple of simple fixes pretty straight away. So that is that's Bevan and I have time to say thank you. And I put my email in the chat if anyone has any questions. I took 2 Zoom calls there last week. I'm always happy to chat, so please don't hesitate at all to get in touch anytime. I'll stop there.
Thanks a million, Mike, and thanks Bevan for being so patient. So that's great. Mike really is a fount of information when it comes to that whole production side of things, and he's got such extensive experience as well, so all of that helps, and he's very generous with his time, Mike, so thank you very much. One thing that I had omitted to add at the end of the initial introduction, talking about context, was just the context in terms of the arts sector generally. And I think there are one or two people maybe from the Arts Council here at the moment, but I suppose it's important to be aware that the Arts Council is due to publish its own arts climate action its own climate action and environmental policy before the end of the year. I think sometime probably in late September, early October. So, it's great to know that that's coming. And I know that there are also lots of other arts organizations that are addressing climate action and environmental sustainability in their own way. So you can learn an awful lot from other people who are doing things. So that whole peer-to-peer, if anybody has anything they want to share today, please feel free. But in terms of the Arts Council, I know that it is part of the condition of funding for those who will be awarded funding for next year. So for example, if you're a strategically funded organization and you're working on your Arts Council application at the moment, or maybe it's gone in, I'm not sure. But if for those of you who are applying, there are a number of strands of funding whereby you will be required as a condition of that when you're awarded it, you will be required to develop your environmental commitments during 2024. So in order to get that money, that's going to be draw down that money, that's going to be a condition. So in other words, that whole sort of more structured approach is going to be coming down from the Arts Council. The Arts Council themselves, because they're seen as a state agency, they fall under the climate action plan as well. So all state agencies have certain commitments now that they have to abide by according to the climate action plan, and those are commitments that a lot of them have to be completed by the end of the year around creating green teams and commitment and showing commitment and green procurement and so on. So all of those things are beginning to filter down from central government through state agencies and inevitably down to anybody who's in the receipt of state funding. And the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaelic, Sports and Media, which is always a mouthful that I have to read because I can't remember it, they are also in the middle of preparing a new national policy framework document on culture, creativity and climate action. So they were doing a bit of consultation earlier this summer. I think they were doing a survey, consultation survey that just ended back in July. So the three focuses of their policy, of that work, is embedding, engaging and enhancing. So just to show that the whole way in which we address climate change is beginning to sort of manifest itself, certainly much more than it did when we kicked off the Green Arts Initiative 5 or 6 years ago. So it's good to see that happening. We had a few questions on energy, so we're going to touch on that a little bit now. And one in particular was about green tariffs, green electricity tariffs. And I think Irma is going to try and share a slide with me, which shows EirGrid, the smart dashboard for EirGrid. So some of you may have a green tariff. For those of you who don't know what that is, you have an option with your most electricity suppliers whereby you opt either for what's seen as a green supplier. So those would be the likes of SE Electricity, Energia, and so on. Or within, say, Electric Ireland, you can opt for a fully green tariff. So what does that mean? Does that mean that you're getting 100%, that your electricity is coming from 100% renewable sources? Well, of course it can't, because those individual suppliers don't have a line that connects them directly to your house to make sure that you have 100% green energy. So what you're getting, what we all get and what we all use, is whatever is on the national grid at any given time. So I'm an addict of this particular website. It's the EirGrid Smart Dashboard, and it allows you to see at any moment in time, on any day, what percentage of our electricity, so this is not our overall energy use, this is just our electricity, what percentage of our electricity is coming from renewable sources. And this is a screenshot that I took on Monday of this week. So you can see that the renewables are 52%. So that was good. I knew it was pretty good because I looked outside and it was pretty windy, and I reckoned it was going to be fairly high on that given day. I can't remember exactly what it was for last year. I mean, I think it's gone up to about 42, 43% on average across a year, but we had a couple of slumpy years, like 2021 was a very poor year for wind energy, for example. This year, I think, has been reasonably good. And obviously there's more and more wind energy suppliers coming onto the market at any time. And wind is, so when we look at renewables, the bulk of that is coming from wind. There is a growing amount of solar going into that. So it's just a useful way of seeing what is coming into you. If you're using electricity, it shows you what's happening. So you can stop sharing that for a minute, please, Irma. But just, so if you're looking for a green tariff, you've got to remember that your electricity is really only going to be as green as the national grid. What you're paying for is those individual suppliers will go and buy green, renewably produced energy, sometimes on the international market. There is a kind of a bit of a question mark over how they do that and how that happens. But it does, at the same time, it pushes those companies to purchase green energy, and that pushes investment into renewable energy sources, renewable electricity sources. So it is good. But as I say, you could never say that your electricity is 100% renewable unless you're off grid and you're powered by wind and solar. That's the only instance where you might say that. So that's in terms of a green tariff. Still worth doing. There is one unusual Irish company called Community Power. I don't know if some of you may have heard of them. I think Irma might have a link to them. So they're a really lovely organisation. They set up from a community-owned the only community-owned wind turbines in Tipperary, and they eventually set up an actual electricity supply company. It is a little bit more expensive at times because they don't have the vast resources to advance buy electricity on the international markets. But all of the money that they make goes into investing in community-owned energy. And it's lovely to think that some of our electricity is owned by the community and is owned by, is Irish owned, rather than, obviously we've got a huge amount of large, big international, like the likes of Statkraft and so on, that come in and are investing in big wind turbines. And we also need that investment. We couldn't do it by ourselves. We have a section on the Green Arts Initiative in Ireland website, which is part of Theatre Forum's website, which gives you a guide to energy, which is just worth looking at. We updated it there a couple of weeks ago to make it as current as possible. So that gives you an overall guide to how you would go about approaching reducing your energy usage, but it also gives you links to a lot of other resources through the ESB, through the SEAI, giving you all kinds of tips and pointers as to how you might reduce your energy, your electricity, and your overall energy usage. So that's well worth looking at. We also did a webinar about in the autumn of last year, which looked at energy usage, and we spoke with Nick Anton from Dunamis for that. But we did, a part of that was how to read your electricity bill. So if you haven't read your electricity bill, or if you've tried to read it and not succeeded, it's a really detailed, to the point of being boring, and I can say that was I did it, analysis of how you would read your electricity bill. Because there are so many costs, you know, when you look at an electricity bill, it gives you all the standing charges, your PSO levy, which is now into a minus, so you should be getting money from your PSO levy. But how you would work out the actual usage, because in a way, when it comes to climate change, the usage is what's important. And the one other thing in terms of electricity, actually, Irma, would you mind sharing that slide again? Briefly, sorry, that was one of the points I wanted to make. And that was around the pattern of how we use energy during the course of the day. Not surprisingly, you can imagine our electricity usage is kind of at a low point, and then we all get up and Ireland wakes up and it puts on the you know, the kettles and dishwashers and everything else in the morning, and the amount of electricity we use inevitably rises. And it peaks between 5 and 7 p.m. Some of you may have heard advice from central government and various other people saying, if you want to help to address some of our emissions coming from electricity, if we can depress that curve, that makes a big difference. Because if you have something like wind, if you have a very windy day and you've got a relatively consistent amount of renewable energy being produced, you come to 5 o'clock, everybody comes home, you know, it's a standard 9 to 5, people come home, children coming home from school, machines are going on, you get this peak as electricity usage rises. So what happens then, in order to cope with that, extra gas generators are turned on. So that's when we would burn extra gas to accommodate that peak. So anything we can do to depress that will make a big difference. And particularly in theatre, that's very relevant. Because if you think about it, a lot of theatre shows, well, I used to run a venue, so people might be working on a show and they might tech it and, run through the lighting, and then they'll take a break. Well, if you can take a break, as much of a break as you can take between 5 and 7 p.m. makes a difference to the overall carbon emissions of our electricity usage. The same as being at home, you know, can you cook something in advance? Can you cook something after that time, before that time? Anything you can do to depress your usage between 5 and 7 p.m. makes a difference. That's great. Thank you, Irma. When I looked at that today, I don't know whether I mentioned it, when I looked at the smart air grid today, it was only 19% renewable because it's a very calm day. So there's not much wind energy being generated. So, okay, so that's in terms of energy. Has anybody any questions? Because it's really helpful when people have questions and we can spark a bit of debate. Anybody questions about their energy usage? One other thing I would say is that it's much easier to deal with decarbonising electricity. Most of you will know that because we have this renewable electricity coming onto the grid. When it comes to heat, it's a much more difficult story because most people's houses are heated either through gas or oil. Oil has a higher carbon footprint, gas is slightly lower, but it's very difficult to decarbonise. It's impossible to decarbonise oil, and decarbonising gas is kind of questionable whether we'll ever manage an awful lot there. So absolutely, but so for anybody in the theatre, again, you know, trying to shift or reduce the carbon impact of your heating is all. The two options would be district heating systems that you might be able to tap into, and heat pumps, which are problematic for very large buildings. Okay. This is something that we did last week, but I'm just going to run through it again. So apologies now again. I know there are a couple of people who were with us last week, but we just thought we would look a little bit at some of the funding that is available for people who want to make changes. And maybe, Irma, you might share that document, and we can give this document to you afterwards. There isn't a huge amount out there specifically for, just see if I can read this properly. Okay, can everybody see that? I can just see a little bit of the top, Irma, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, we'd be the same. You could just see up to Green Arts Clinic. Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's great. That's much better. Thanks, Irma, that's great. So the first thing I'd say is there is a funding scheme for building-based organisations through the Department of Arts, and that's called the Cultural Capital Scheme, and it's Stream E, and the focus is on refurbishing and enhancing the existing stock of cultural buildings. And but there is a focus on reducing the carbon footprint as well. So that is one element that is covered in this scheme. So there are grants of up to 50,000 for not-for-profit organisations, and grants of up to 20,000 get a sort of beneficial rate. So 85%, up to 85% of that amount can be grant funded unless you're a local authority, and then it goes down to 60%. So that's very sizable. It's really worth looking at in terms of the matching funding is quite small. Then when it comes to that slightly larger spend of 50,000, it's funded up to 70%. And again, down to 60% for local authority owned facilities. So there are lots of kind of things that you could do for that. Lighting and sound equipment, for example, sensor lighting. We touched on this again last week, that if you haven't got sensor lighting in your building, that's a really useful way of reducing your electricity usage. And there are all kinds of things around heating and plumbing upgrades, ventilation systems. Improved zoning, again, was another thing we touched on, that often theatre buildings are zoned into a small number of zones, and that makes it very difficult then to manage the heating. So that's something, and I've known theatres that have rezoned their buildings into a larger number of zones, smaller areas, and that has helped to reduce their overall heating costs. Air tightness for any building makes a huge difference, so that you're not losing energy through gaps in doors, old windows, and so on. So those minor building works would be covered by that grant. So it's definitely well worth looking at. It hasn't got an end date. I think it's got a set fund, and when that fund is finished, that is the end of the scheme. Again, apologies, this is a repetition of last week, but the SEAI will fund an energy audit voucher of up to €2,000. So for anybody who's in a building, a theatre building, or that uses more than €10,000 worth of energy in a year, you're entitled to avail of that grant. And that voucher really that €2,000 would cover the cost of most audits, unless you've got a very complex building. So I think that's well worth looking at. PV panels, again, for buildings that are suitable, that have, that maybe own their building, where the roof is suitable and so on, that is definitely something worth looking at. And more so for the buildings that are particularly active during the day. So if you're an art centre, if you have other activities happening during the day, PV can work really, really well. And the grants I've outlined them there, they're up to 2,400 for anything up to a 6 kilowatt system. Over 7 kilowatts is an extra €300 per kilowatt power. There are no grants now for batteries. So if you want to install a battery, that would be at your own cost. But there is what's called the Clean Export Premium Tariff for any of those over 7 kilowatt systems. Well, there's basically a tariff no matter what. So you will get paid for some of the energy that you generate, not for all of it. But if you generate electricity and you're feeding it back into the grid, there is a tariff for a certain amount of that, which helps to make sense of the whole thing. So it's definitely worth thinking about, as I say, for those organisations that are active during the day. Enterprise Ireland have a new grant, energy efficiency grant, that they launched in June of this year. Again, really useful for small works. It only funds 50% of energy efficiency measures up to a ceiling of €5,000. So if you spend €10,000 or less, they will fund 50% of it. Now, the only sort of caveat to that is those measures would need to have been identified in an SEAI audit. In other words, they want to make sure that they're funding measures that are going to make a difference. So all the more reason to get your SEAI audit. And I think Anna mentioned last week, which is very true, is that if you're applying for a capital funding from the department, it's obviously very, very useful to have that SEAI audit done, because it gives you a sort of there's kind of a genuine need identified within those. It's not just something random that you've decided. There's a kind of authoritative element to it. So that's the only other one, which is maybe not so relevant. Yeah, I suppose just in terms of what those things would fund, it's things like refrigeration units, industrial dishwashers, engineering equipment, variable speed drives. So there's a link there that Irma might be able to share with you about where you can find it. So it's through the local enterprise offices. And finally, there's the Community Climate Action Fund. This would be more relevant for artists, and particularly artists who might be involved in local artist groups or other initiatives locally. It's a small fund to get small practical measures, and each local authority is administering a fund. So, for example, the kind of criteria would be that it has to be delivered in a community or local area. It must be not for profit, and it must contribute to developing low carbon and environmental sustainable communities. And that fund varies from local authority to local authority in how it's administered and whether it's actually open for applications yet. But I think that's it then. Thank you, Irma. Now, any questions? We're all very quiet. Okay, well, the next question we did have was about heritage buildings. So the building we work in is a heritage one. There's lots to do, but what can we do now? So that is a big issue. Probably not as much as it would be in the UK, where there's a lot of older theatres and a lot of older buildings that have been converted to theatres. But there are a number of there are buildings like the Town Hall Theatre in Galway, the Theatre Royal, but it wouldn't, and there are places like Dunamis which have been converted. So there are a number. So the general feeling is, and there has been some research that Irma is sharing with you there, that there is a lot that can be done, and particularly around airtightness. So often for an older building, there are gaps in windows, gaps where doors close, there is heat escaping that may not be proper insulation. So there is definitely room, particularly for in terms of heat and stopping heat escaping from a building. There are definitely a lot of things that can be done. We had hoped that Mary Boland from the Theatre Royal would be able to talk to us today, but unfortunately she couldn't be with us in the end. But I know they're doing a lot of work in Theatre Royal and Town Hall Theatre, so that there are measures that can be implemented. And as I say, there are a couple of research pieces that were done by the SEAI and various others over the last decade, just identifying what could be done. And remember that when it comes to behavioural change, it doesn't matter how old your building is. If you're talking about turning off lights and becoming more efficient about how you use equipment, that applies regardless of the age of your building. So to bear that in mind. Now, those small bit we've done on, I'm conscious that we have about 10 minutes, and I know 11 minutes, we have a nice little recording from Paddy and Lisa from the Theatre Green Book, talking about in a little interview with Anna. So we do want to share that, but we might just look at travel, because we did a little sort of infographic that Irma might be able to share with us now in a minute. But maybe to start by saying that when it comes to travel, I think I mentioned it earlier, and I also mentioned it last week, travel is the big stubborn one for Irish society. It's the one that we haven't managed to crack. We really haven't managed to kind of get out of our cars. And that's really the critical thing for people who do drive a lot. Many of you may be living in cities, you might not own cars, you may drive very little. But just to give you an example of, for example, if you wanted to travel from Dublin to Kerry, which is about 200, we do this one by one, 292 kilometers. So if you flew, it would be 72 kilos of CO2. And bear in mind that a short distance flight is more energy intensive than a longer one, because a lot of the energy is used in the takeoff and landing. So if you took off in Dublin and landed in Kerry, that has a higher per kilometre impact than if you flew to London or you flew to Germany or wherever. Thank you, Irma. So the next one then is plane has the highest impact. A petrol car has the next at 54 kilos of CO2. After that, it's a diesel car, which is 49 kilos of CO2. After that, it's an electric car, which has, I think it's about 25 kilos of CO2. The next would be a train, which has 10, and a bus, which is 8. Now, I'd argue the toss a little bit about the bus and the train, because for anybody who's got a bus from Kerry to Dublin recently, you spend a lot longer than you should on the bus, and you spend a lot of time in traffic. And of course, it's when a bus is delayed, it's using more and more fuel. So it's just to give you a sense of what the difference is between flying and taking a bus. If you were to go to Munich if you drove to Munich, it would be worse than flying. So just to bear that in mind. People often think, well, if I drove, it would be better. But actually, driving long distances is worse than flying. And maybe just on to the next slide, just to show if you were going to Dublin, Kerry and back. So, you know, there was a big difference between the worst and the best options. And the best options are for longer distances. Once you start talking about international travel, the actual carbon footprint reduces further, because, you know, if you're traveling on a fast train from Brussels to Cologne, for example, the carbon footprint per kilometre would be less again, because it's a fast train. It doesn't stop very often. It's very efficient. So international travel is actually by train is more efficient than by bus or by coach. So I think now I know Anna's anxious to show the we had a couple of other things, but we might keep them for another day. But has anybody any questions? Anything on travel? We did mention, maybe just touch on last week, the fact that there are a lot of that the public transport is improving. I know it's slowly, and I know there are a lot of people. I live in Dingle, so there are a lot of people who don't have good local services, but I think that is improving. And if you look out, maybe just even check out local link services in your area, because that has improved dramatically over the last number of years. But yes, yeah, we were going to kind of give you an example of how you might, if you wanted to convert a kilometre of travel in any of those modes of transport, there's a very good resource, a bit complicated, produced by the British government that a lot of people use. That is called the BEIS figures, and Irma has just shared the link to that page there, and they're free to use, and people all over Western Europe use them. But Anna, I'm over to you now, because you're going to do the little piece on the Theatre Green Book with Paddy and Lisa.
A quick reprise on some of the discussion this morning. I suppose it's true to say that this discussion, like every Green Arts one, is a very multifaceted one. So while it feels like you might be hearing lots of different aspects of what you can do, or related to productions, or related to your building, if you're an arts organization in a building, they do all come together. And I think there's going to be more and more pressure to think, I suppose, holistically and systemically about how we tackle climate action in a more, I suppose, organised and concerted way over the coming while. The Theatre Green Book, which Mike and Katrina have both been talking about, obviously the 3 volumes that people are most familiar with are the buildings one, the operations one, and the productions one. But the additional volume, 4th volume, released earlier this year, might be the one that's most relevant to arts organisations here, and that's the Arts Green Book. And that deals with mixed use, multidisciplinary arts centre type spaces, including galleries, libraries, and, you know, that the sort of the National Theatre in London, or indeed Cork Opera House, or our own Abbey Theatre or University Concert Hall in Limerick, are very large theatres, and they've got very particular requirements. Whereas I think the Arts Green Book is probably the one that's most relevant to a lot of people on this call, and a lot of buildings-based arts organisations over the coming while. There is a bit of joining the dots after a lot of these conversations happening in pockets over the last few years. And one of the discussions which we will hopefully bring to, invite people into, will be later this year. We'll be looking at the department's approach to capital grants and trying to link those to things like SEAI, vouchers and energy surveys and energy consumption. And the difficult one, which we don't really know how to tackle without your input, is this issue of audience travel in relation to venues, art centres and theatres and programming. The transport infrastructure is something that is, not very adaptable, or at least it doesn't adapt very quickly. But it is a big issue. Audiences and their much preferred mode of travel, which unfortunately seems to be cars, is an issue that needs to be tackled over the coming year. Just a short clip, all of these resources, the Theatre Green Book resources, are free to use and accessible to everybody. They are on the Green Arts Initiative in Ireland website, and we'll continue to add to them as soon as we get updates and adaptations for Ireland, working with the Theatre Green Book team. But the short clip here was from the Waterford gathering, where we were talking to the Theatre Green Book founders, Paddy and Lisa, about the Theatre Green Book and its relevance for assessing the sustainability and improving the sustainability of buildings, but most particularly in organising an approach to capital expenditure programmes and making the most of available resources and investment to make buildings as sustainable as possible, and to do so in an efficient way, in every way, for the organisation. So this is the video clip, it's about 8 minutes, 7.5 minutes, with Paddy and Lisa, founders of the Theatre Green Book. And good to see everybody this morning. Paddy and Lisa, thank you very much for that. Sometimes the question that we would hear from people is, how relevant is the Theatre Green Book to my organisation? Maybe especially if it's a smaller theatre or an art centre and not on the scale of the National Theatre.
Yeah, no, I can completely understand that concern, and would say that it's absolutely relevant to every size of organisation. It was made drawing on the expertise of smaller and larger organisations. So we really hope that between the guidance and the standards, there's something in there that will be right for everybody's situation.
And Paddy, during your discussion of the Theatre Green Book, you mentioned the addition recently of the Arts Green Book and suggested that it might be more suitable for arts and cultural buildings in general. Do you want to add anything to that? Because our infrastructure, built arts infrastructure here, is probably differs in scale to the UK, Scottish or Welsh ones, or Northern Ireland indeed as well.
So when we were making the Green Book, it grew out of the theatre and performance sector. But in working on the buildings volume, and I'm an architect by background, we were perfectly aware that these principles are transferable really to any building, and certainly to any cultural building. What we then did with the Arts Green Book is to say, okay, let's expand that buildings volume so it does cover all building types, all cultural building types, including multi-use buildings, which I know are quite common in the Republic, and make sure that we've got notes that draw out some of the particular issues for certain building types. There are issues that cinemas particularly face. There are issues that museums and galleries face, for example, about the environment for storage and that sort of thing. So we hope there are notes in there that will really help anybody, whatever their cultural sector.
And speaking to you previously, you mentioned that other adaptations of the Theatre Green Book have been really useful to align stakeholders, which might be particularly important in Ireland because our buildings are owned or managed or indeed controlled by local authorities, so they can be quite independent. I think you mentioned in your experience that the Theatre Green Book has the ability to align all of those stakeholders. Has that been your experience?
I think we feel strongly that the more a lot of people are following a similar guidance and a similar approach, then there can start to be an understanding of what organisations need and where they are in their journey. Certainly, we're very familiar both with theatres and with other cultural buildings, that there's a whole lot of different arrangements for ownership of the buildings and who has the responsibility. And certainly using the home survey tool in the buildings volume, it will identify those things which are easy wins or maintenance projects, which might be the responsibility of the occupant, and those which need to be the responsibility of the landlord or owner. And so I think as we start to all report in that way, it will be much easier to understand. And already we're seeing this, the situation across the estate.
And the big capital expenditure projects, I mean, ultimately after the quick wins and the intermediate improvements, you get to the bigger capital expenditure requirement to bring buildings up to standards. In some ways, the toolkits available from Theatre Green Book and others that are available from the SEAI and other organisations here, where do you see those making the case for capital expenditure at a level that's needed?
Well, I think there are two things we're very, very aware of here. One is that with sustainability of all kinds, not just in buildings, it's very easy to get lost in the woods. You know, where do I start? Where do I put the energy? Which is why you quite often see the first thing people do is rush off and put some photovoltaic cells on the roof, even though that's very often not the first thing to do. The other thing we're really aware of is, and this applies to every country in Europe, is that we've got a real shortfall in terms of the costs of making our public buildings fit for purpose in the context of the climate emergency. What that means is that we all need to be really rigorous in ensuring that whatever energy and bandwidth we have in our organizations and whatever money we can access is being focused where it's going to have the most impact in improving our buildings. Now, the physics is shared. We know how to make buildings sustainable. So auditing, making a sustainability plan, working out what the first thing to do is and putting your energy there is the essential precursor to sensible use of our funds. And you can do that through the toolkit in the Green Book. You can do that through an SEAI energy audit. I would hope that they'll get probably not to exactly the same thing, but to basically the same conclusion. And that's the first step in starting to make your building sustainable.
So as well as helping the organisation, the Theatre Green Book toolkits, or indeed the SEAI energy audit, can help to systematically, I suppose, look at the requirements and the investment required in various buildings.
Yes, that absolutely.
Just, I suppose, a principle of the Theatre Green Book, which I think is one that we're all familiar with from even our brief discussions with you so far, is that it's an action learning programme and it's a very collaborative approach, and that the resources remain freely available and accessible to all. And I think that's something that we understand every adaptation of the Theatre Green Book must carry forward.
Yeah, no, that's utterly common with all the partnerships that we're setting up and the translations. It has to keep living and breathing. We know that practice is adapting around the world all the time, and we want each of our networks to be developing locally, but also sharing across those networks. And to be able to do that in a good faith way, we need to know that everybody's is making this resource available for free. Not least because we can learn from all organisations and individuals. And then what we want to do is that by having everybody work in a standardised way, as Renew Culture, Paddy and I, that we can make sure the networks themselves are also coordinating and learning from each other. And we've already had some fantastic examples of network sharing between different partnerships.
I said, we're certainly looking forward to working with you some more. And indeed, everybody in the room here today in Waterford is also very keen on continuing to maybe deepen a working relationship and maybe to get more involved and to spread the Theatre Green Book word more widely and make the progress that we all need to make. Thank you both very much. Thank you, and great to see everybody still on the call. Just thank you again, Katrina, because I said you do cast or shed light, but not electrically powered light, on so many green arts topics for all of us. It's a constant, I suppose, revelation and update to keep us, thinking in the right way. We will be doing more work for those people who all the Theatre Green Book resources will be on the Green Arts Initiative website. The productions volume that Mike spoke about is, is one aspect of the work of the Theatre Green Book and possibly the best well known. But for buildings-based arts organisations, and I said it is a holistic approach, the Arts Green Book is also worth looking at, including its section on historic buildings, which a lot of art centres, theatres and venues would be considered historic buildings, or at least would have some conservation concerns. But we will continue this conversation. There is a bit of joining of the dots to do around the sustainability plans, capital expenditure programs, and also maybe looking at the department and how they're structuring schemes so that people can adopt a bigger, longer term, more informed approach and a sort of a scaled approach to capital investment programs, and also in relation to production budgets, looking at how part of those budgets can be allocated to greening your productions, including touring. So more from Katrina and the Green Arts Initiative over the next few months, and we'll stay in touch and be looking to you for your contributions around all of those topics in the coming months. But thank you again, and lovely to see you.
The more people let us know what is useful to them, what kind of help or support they need, the more relevant it can be.